Hey everyone, welcome back to Data and Donuts. My name's Aaron. I'm here with my friend and colleague, Terrence Willett. Today we're going to talk around a variety of topics, being confronting and mitigating bias, IRBs, and human subject research, considerations to have across all these aspects as they really blend together when conducting research internally and externally. But before we get into our conversation today, I'll have Terrence share a little bit about himself.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Terrence Willett, Dean of Research Planning and Institutional Effectiveness at the college, soon to be formally known as Cabrillo, changing the name to not be named after a conquistador. So that's an exciting process that touches on some of what we're talking about. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Excellent. And so, because these are so interrelated topics, I think what I would like to probably start with is human subject research. And so, Terrence, on a day-to-day basis, we run into human subject research interacting with secondary data, interviews, collaborations, observations, and the like. How do you go about conducting human subject research, and what considerations do you put in place as safeguards?
Yeah, because there's the normal stuff that my office will do, and we have a lot of standard language, like let's use surveys as an example. You want to make sure that people engaging in the survey understand that it's voluntary, that their data will be maintained with confidentiality. They won't be individually identified, but warn them we will select some pull quotes, and that. And what's the purpose of it? That they're not just doing it to do it, but we're actually going to use this information for improvements for instruction, which of course is also a necessary criteria for that type of work to be exempt from IRB review. We also do a lot of database research that are used for reports and such. The students don't necessarily think about it that way when they're registering and getting their grades, that they're feeding data into a data system that then is used for a lot of reporting. And then we ensure that when we have dashboards and reports, that we don't expose identities. So you have small cell count suppression built into dashboards and other safeguards to help protect a student identity while you're showing achievement patterns. Focus groups are even more critical because you tend to drift into sensitive topics even if you're not intending to, and making sure that people understand it's voluntary, it won't impact their grades. There's a separation between research and your teachers, and that they can walk away anytime without any consequence. But then you also have to warn them that if they say something reportable, that you're required to report it, which is also true in surveys. And there's a couple of times when students have revealed incidents in surveys that I've had to pass on to the dean of students.
Yeah, and I think that's some of the challenges that as we start thinking about society and how data is so immersive around us, how are we utilizing that? How are we sharing that? And then, almost like when you go on websites where they say, like, here's a cookie that tracks your data because of privacy law. And I'm wondering, as like iPhones and Androids and other devices continue to ask us more and more about privacy and information, what data is collected, how do we formulate that language so our consumers, our students, or our public are aware of what information is being given and utilized, and how does that work in relation to privacy laws, FERPA, higher education, and the like, because there are certain things that are required by federal funding and federal law and state law that we have to report and collect. And so that will be an interesting fact in the future as we start to develop and build on privacy as a practice at our institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And then a lot of the work that we do, because it's required and exempt, we still want to have the good practice of protecting privacy and letting students know what we're doing with the data. And then you have folks outside of the research office, both within and outside of the institution, who want to do human subjects research. So you might have faculty who got a grant and they want to survey students on a sensitive topic, or external researcher, grad student who wants some data, and as a researcher, I always want to support that, but then they have to go through the process. And so we have an established institutional review board that's recognized by the federal government, the HHS, Health and Human Services. And sometimes it's an expedited review if it's fairly minimal survey, and usually in the case of graduate students, they have an IRB from their university, and so then we take a look at it and review it, and almost always good to go because they tend to be pretty thorough. Sometimes people get a little squirrely about it because they may not like to deal with bureaucracy and process. And so it's helpful to try to explain to people, why do you have to go through the IRB? I've had some people who don't get it, and they've conducted surveys and focus groups without talking to me because it's always well intentioned, right? They just want to hear from the students and do something right. And then I have to be really clear with them that, hey, you're conducting unauthorized human subjects research, on a campus where I'm the chief research officer, and let me bring you under my wing, and let's bring you through the process, and let's do it right. And usually people are good about it, but I need to enhance my education of people, because we get a lot of turnover too, and you get new people, and so you have to continuously remind people of these ethics. Just the same thing as cybersecurity, training. How many times have you done it? But you got to do it every year, right? Just to stay fresh.
I agree, and I think it's a really good subject to bring up. Is a lot of institutions have IRBs, others may not have that, and other processes. So, for example, or for question, and then I'll give an example, is how did you go about getting IRB approval? And then if you don't have IRB approval, what suggestions do you have? And I'll share an example of what I've observed.
Yeah, I want to give credit to College of the Canyons and Daley Meischke in particular for being my mentor and guide on that process. If you go to their website, they've really good examples. I borrowed from them heavily. You go to the HHS website, and they've got training modules to learn about IRBs and the process, and there's forms that you fill out. It's bureaucratic, and there's an annual renewal process. And then when you go through the training and submit your paperwork, and you have to indicate who your IRB members are, and then you get a number. Actually, you have a numeric code that becomes your IRB ID. And then whenever you switch members out of your IRB, you have to inform them, okay, here's the new members, and there's membership requirements. For example, you have to have at least one non-scientist, one non-community member, and it's good practice to have diversity in all of its dimensions, racial, gender, and so on. And so it's go to HHS website and fill out a bunch of forms.
Excellent, excellent. I think that's a good testament. And like I said, hopefully after this video, I'll set a couple links maybe to your site and to also College of the Canyons to share what processes you have set up in place. I've also seen boards set up. So, for example, at Coastline, we have a research and ethics board. It's
Mhm.
not formally recognized IRB, but it follows the same principles and practices of an IRB in structure and process. And I think, like I said, coming into this, looking at what is needed for an IRB, because I don't know if your institution receives more requests than we do. You probably do. When going through that request, we follow through the same protocol and practice of what's the harms to the students, the institution, the community, and there have been times where we've said no, but just because while the research may have been good, the implications on the published results may be a very poor light on our students, may be identifiable, or may be something of a challenge to the institution. So looking at that when setting these up, looking at the benefit of the research, not just the implications of findings, but the benefit for the researcher, but then also for the institution as a sponsor, are factors to take in. And so it really leads into our conversation about human subject research and bias. I think that's something that I love when people are like, we run an objective office. It's not true. No one has an objective anything. Like, you can be as objective, even looking at your numbers. Those are objective, but are they? And I think looking at that and how things are framed, it's something that we continually work on, is trying to be as neutral as possible. But how do you, as you know, in your experience over time, have addressed your own bias and understand and continue to do that?
Yeah, it's a tough one. There's the myth of being objective. All your research and science training tries to bring you along that path, but then you have other philosophies and philosophers who say there's no such thing as being objective. I found that on top of my scientific training, that's helped a lot on the technical side about bias, like things understanding question wording effect, for example. Um, or looking for survival bias and confirmation bias when interpreting data and developing hypotheses. I've found that a lot of the equity training that I've received is also extremely helpful because it's talking about a different kind of bias: implicit bias, explicit bias, how you treat other people. But it helps you realize that you are biased, that you have been raised in a culture that has imposed stereotypes upon you that are very difficult to escape. And how does that not impact the way you interpret data, the questions you choose to chase down, the variables you choose to include in a multivariate regression? What are the background variables that you really think are important? And so we talk about a lot in my office about bias and being clear that we have bias that is somewhat insurmountable, but you can work to mitigate it. And one of the mitigants is a peer review process, having other people look at what you're doing and give their perspectives on it. And almost always I get value from it. Considerations I hadn't thought of, other interpretations, data elements that I should have included that I hadn't. Um, and so those are some areas there. I think too, and just to throw it back at you, you know, uh, we've got some controversial policies these days, right? Like AB 1705, and real differences of opinion on the interpretations of the data. And I see, survival bias coming in there a lot. And just curious what you've seen and how bias has impacted your work and implementation of some of these efforts.
So I think you bring up a great point with survival bias. I think we like to hear a lot of what you and I call anecdata, a lot of data that helps people because, well, I went through these 5,000 steps and they want to have that, confirmation that, if well, I did it, then everybody should do it. And traditionally, this is how it's always been done. I think the challenge that we face with slower moving organizations and institutions is the lack of calculated risk in a timely manner. And I think there's a lot of times that progression and perfection, or perfection, and the fear of failing limits us for our progression moving forward. And I think a lot of the times we expect everything to be perfect the first time, but we have to learn that everything's almost like an experiment and we don't know what's going to happen. And it shifts between terms and with people and students and situations, social and psychological factors influence in what will occur. Because what I see is with like AB 1705, AB 705, pathway, so many things, we do a lot of data autopsy,
Mhm.
saying what happened X amount of years ago. But there's so many factors of the whole student experience that aren't included in what could be of now. Because if you look at our institutions as of now, as of next year or 2 years, we're not going to be the same institution we were 3, 4 years ago. So I think looking at that and considering that and pointing that out to individuals and almost setting that framework can help us address a lot of those and mitigate a lot of those biases and those issues or those confirmations that limit and maybe even cause barriers or create new barriers, and I think that's some of the factors that it's what a part of what I call is decision intelligence is a lot of the time that we look at, like we can't just assume like it's like 1990s accounting that it's going to be cyclical, same things occurring over time. We have to understand things are evolving, and while we can use data to inform that, and we can use approaches to inform that in previous practices, what are we doing today to prepare for tomorrow? Because tomorrow's going to look way different than 2 or 3 days ago. I think that's some of the logic that some people don't want to apply because it's easy to keep the same. When you're comfortable, it's great. And I think that's some of the challenges that we face, I think, with that, and that comfort and that safety is what creates that bias, because it creates a false state of protection and safety when, something new can then say, I don't want to do that, regardless of what the potential opportunity exists. It may also have a potential harm. And so I think those are some of that's like the theoretical approach to that, and look of how I see where bias comes in is what's causing that bias, almost like a root cause analysis of why is it no, or why are you saying we should do this, and it really comes down to perspective, preference, and experience. And I think that's some of the stuff that, how do we address that, and still embrace individuals' diverse perspective of thought, background, cultures, and the like. And so that's a shifting type of navigation we're going to have to do in the near future, and in future plans and initiatives, is because, like I said, I remember when AB 705 came out, and there was a lot of controversy around that at my
Hmm.
institutions and other institutions. Have the results been perfect? No, not at all. And we could all say that. Like, there's two wins. There's a win, there's a loss. Like, you have a higher throughput, but you have a lower rate of success. But, time to completion potentially could be increased, right? So there's always like a give or take in a variety of aspects. Is 100% of people going to make it through? At this point, probably not. And we're doing our best we can to get us through that, but how do we do that in a way that's beneficial to all, and then do we create opportunities across the way? And it looks like Daniel's joining our meeting as well, because this is an open link. We're almost ready, Daniel, for our meeting. Well, I'll give you a
Hey,
text
let's
when,
have them
when we're
join
good.
in.
That's fine, Daniel, so you can join in this meeting. So we'll jump into our planning meeting afterwards. But what our conversation today is really looking at, how do you mitigate bias? How do we also address things? I think Terrence brought up, and was bringing forward, was there's a lot of conversations and plans that are occurring. He used AB 705, AB 1705, where there's a lot of differences of opinion, and how do you address those biases? And so what we were talking about is survival bias, confirmation bias, and things of that magnitude. I don't know. While you're back in here, what's your thoughts on that?
Oh wow, such a uh, controversial topic to be brought in on at the last minute. But nonetheless, God, there's so much to be said about bias, in particular, implicit bias. Um, and so, uh, implicit bias, as you may or may not know, operates at a very unconscious level. And it's automatic. We have neural connections that we make that are just automatic. And when we come across certain stimuli in the environment, it primes us immediately to have a reaction. And so biases are very hard to control in that manner. That's why we have to be very cognizant of our particular biases, um, depending on what type of environment that we're currently interacting with. So it's important. Pay attention to the social cues in your environment.
Yeah, yeah. I was mentioning how, in terms of mitigating bias, there's that science research training we had, but then that there's also the equity training that we get that really helps with that implicit bias, but it can't take it away, right? It can just make you more aware of it and come up with strategies to mitigate it. And with one of the factors that Aaron was bringing up is this perceptual difference with the AB 705, where from the policymakers, they're looking at the throughput rates, these huge increases in the volumes of particularly Hispanic and Black students who are passing transfer level math in particular, and also English. But then there's this depression of success rates, and so then if you're in the classroom, your perception is, I got more students failing, and that is like really a Simpsons paradox type of a bias in terms of what you see in the aggregate versus the disaggregated data, but then it creates these very different perceptions of people in different circumstances. And then Aaron was also pointing out how when we make our decision making, we all have jobs and careers, and there's a bias in shaping policies that help our day to day as well, that may be at odds with what's best for the student or the community at large. And then I think, as you're bringing in, quite correctly, there's that implicit bias of which students do we believe can succeed or not, and how does that impact their experience?
I think that's a key element. And like I said, Daniel, some of the things we talked about beforehand was about the data autopsy and how to be like, this has always happened, therefore I've always experienced this, I've always seen this, and
Yeah.
how do we address those future trends when maybe your historical experience influenced by a variety of factors outside of your sphere of control could then shift the future outcomes. So as we're closing out this conversation, and you're more than welcome, Terrence, to stay on. I'll stop the record. We could continue to our next conversation, but you're more than welcome to jump off if you want. Is my final question? I'll ask you both. This is, and so then you have to answer the bonus question, all right, Daniel? So you can do it here. Is what's your favorite show, and what are you currently streaming or watching?
My favorite show of all time or currently?
Sure. Why don't you go favorite show of all time and then currently what you're watching?
Okay, favorite show of all time. Um, Actually, let me start with what I'm currently watching. Spy X Family. I'm waiting for the next season to come out. It's an anime. It's a fun comedy spy show. I've been really enjoying that one, and so it may become my favorite of all time.
Well, check that. What about you, Daniel?
Well, I'm going to date myself here. I'm not really too big on streaming. That requires some thought to like, oh, what do I want to sit and watch? So I'm a fan of cable. And
That's
I
good.
actually just like whatever I flip through and whatever's on. So I really don't have a particular show that I'm watching right now. I'm just the kind of guy that will sit down and if something comes across that's interesting, I'll sit, watch it, and enjoy it.
Excellent, excellent. So,
Well, I'll throw out I had all the time to think. So I think my current all-time favorite, I'm going to stick with the anime theme, is Cowboy Bebop.
okay,
I'll go back to that one. It's got great music, good, it's like a private eye in space thing. So it's pretty groovy.
nice. I'll have to check that out and cool. And so, with that, Terrence, you're more than welcome to stay, but I'm going to stop recording and I'll delete this part out so we're perfectly fine of me saying this. But no, so what's it called? So, are you open to stay for our next conversation or you got to
Actually, I'm going to
go?
bounce. I'm meeting a colleague for lunch, but
All
thank you
good.
for inviting me. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us. I
I,
know we kind of put you on the spot, but you did
no,
great.
you did.
And thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining.
Oh,
Hey,
that
no worries. I
Terrence
think
is
I
nice.
like this idea of multiple people here. It's actually more of a fun conversation because we have multiple
Hmm.
perspectives. I think
That's
I think
true.
that's something I'm going to try to introduce in the near future. This is fun. So, all
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
For
all right,
season
Terrence,
four, Aaron. Season
there
4.
you go. I think that's the plan. So I will see you later, Terrence, and then
All
we'll
righty.
jump into our thing.
Good seeing you guys.
All right, take
See
care,
ya.
Terrence.
Bye.
So I'm gonna